Sometimes the best history consists of the most incredible stories, and the War of 1812 has its fair share of yarns. And what's even better is, as a tourist, it's so easy to walk in the footsteps of the past. Take the burning of Washington. It's a little-known story, but a corker, which involves the White House and the Capitol building being reduced to smoking shells. Here's how the story goes. On Friday, the 19th of August, 1814, 5,000 crack British troops under the command of veteran General Robert Ross landed Benedict, Maryland, just 32 miles southeast of Washington. They marched north. On Monday, 22nd August, the British forces reach Upper Marlborough. There they're joined by the hated Admiral George Cockburn and his Marines. By now, the British are only 20 miles from Washington. But the American government still has no idea in which direction they're headed. Will they continue north to Baltimore or turn towards the capital? Both are undefended. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of this campaign is the state of the British Army. They've been fighting for years against Napoleon, so we know they're professionals. But after 6 weeks at sea, they arrive here in the Chesapeake during one of the hottest summers ever. It hasn't rained for 3 weeks. It's over 100 degrees, and they march. This is pretty hard going. In fact, the conditions today are not that different from what they were back then. It's 9 o'clock in the morning and it's already over 90 degrees. Now, I'm no Napoleonic veteran, but those accounts we have of soldiers collapsing at the roadside, wilting in the heat, some dropping dead, suddenly make awful sense. It's hard work. Surprisingly, on Wednesday, the 24th of August, here at Bladensburg, the Americans suffer a catastrophic defeat, leaving Washington open to the Brits. For 3 days, the American capital has been in chaos. Its citizens abandoning their homes, carting out their furniture and valuables, the various state departments shipping out documents, including the Declaration of Independence. Of course, Washington wasn't a city like this. Only 15 years old, it was barely a town, a village, 8,000 inhabitants, its avenues mud tracks, but it was the seat of government. And here were the nation's two most iconic buildings, the White House and the Capitol. There was also the Naval Yard, where the young nation's first warships were built, and where its commandant, Thomas Tingey, had spent the day nervously awaiting the outcome of the battle. Finally, at around 8 p.m, Tingey gives the orders to burn. Provisions, sail and ordnance all go up in smoke, and the British march into Washington to the glow of fires. Today, all that remains from 1814 is Tingey's own quarters and the main gate with its Doric columns. The British were very focused in their objectives. Their aim was to humiliate the Americans by destroying their public buildings. And first up was the Capitol. Anthony, when the British arrived in Washington, they focused on public buildings, and you can't get more public than the Capitol.
Yes, the British reassured the remaining residents that their lives and their property would be safe so long as they didn't take up arms against the occupying force. With one or two exceptions, they adhered to that. They were scrupulously fair in sparing the private property.
I'm imagining it's quite a challenge to burn a building like that.
Yes, what the British did, they went into rooms and they assembled the furniture. And in rooms where there was not enough furniture, they hacked at the doors and window frames and they spread the piles of wood with the combustible content of their Congreve rockets. They also tried to fire rockets at the ceiling, but they found that the wood was 16 inches deep and there was plate glass there and iron sheeting, so that failed. But the bonfires worked.
All that remains today of the original Capitol is a section of sandstone wall west of the Senate chamber. As the Capitol burned, the British moved on to the White House, where Dolly Madison was waiting for news.
A horseman galloped down Pennsylvania Avenue and shouted at everybody to flee the city because the British were on the verge of capturing the capital. Dolly refused to leave the White House, even though the president had already crossed the river to Virginia, where they were going to meet up. She insisted on staying to save a portrait of George Washington by the famous artist Gilbert Stuart. This was to save it for posterity, for future generations. Who amongst us would risk our lives for a painting? She did. That night, the British burned the White House.
Before they burnt it, I understand that when the British turned up, they found, for want of better words, a ready-made meal waiting for them.
Yes, Dolly had been expecting the cabinet, the military leaders, and some other guests for dinner at 3 p.m. So they brought up the ale, the wine, and the British set to with abandon. They feasted inelegantly. They poured wine from decanters into cut glass. They were toasting the health of the Prince Regent and the success of His Majesty's land and naval forces. They even drank to peace with America and down with Madison. And when one of the men found the ceremonial hat belonging to the president, he raised it by the tip of his bayonet, and he said if they could not capture the little president, Madison was only 5'4", they would parade his hat in England.
The fires in Washington burned through the night and into the next day, when, as if by a miracle, the dry spell broke and a storm swept through the city. Some public buildings collapsed, even British soldiers were killed. That evening, the British left, and we never invaded Washington again.